The rumble of the military convoy grew louder as it approached the imposing iron gates. Dust clouds swirled behind the olive-green trucks, settling like a grim shroud over the women huddled inside. Dozens of German prisoners sat rigid on wooden benches, their faces pale with terror, eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from knowing your fate rests in enemy hands. Among them sat Greta, a 20-year-old nurse whose hands trembled as she clutched her small medical bag. Beside her, Maria, a secretary barely out of her teens, whispered silent prayers through lips that had forgotten how to smile. These women, nurses, clerks, radio operators, auxiliary workers, had served the Reich with dedication. Now they were prisoners, transported like cargo toward an uncertain destiny. The trucks lurched to a halt with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo through their very souls. In the sudden silence that followed, a new sound emerged, the heavy, deliberate crunch of American military boots on gravel. Each footstep struck like a hammer blow against their hearts. Through the canvas covering, they could see shadows moving, tall, broad-shouldered silhouettes that seemed impossibly large against the fading afternoon light. The Americans had arrived, and with them came the confirmation of every nightmare their officers had planted in their minds. Rifles glinted in the golden hour sunlight. Barbed wire stretched endlessly in every direction, its cruel spirals catching the light like thousands of tiny knives. Watchtowers loomed overhead, dark sentinels against the sky, each one a reminder that escape was impossible. The words of their commanding officers echoed in their memories like a death knell. The Americans are savages. They show no mercy to German women. If captured, you will face humiliation worse than death itself. Those warnings, delivered with such conviction, now felt like prophecies about to be fulfilled. As the truck doors began to open, the women braced themselves for the horror they had been promised would come. The memories flooded back as if a dam had burst in their minds. Just weeks earlier, they had sat in briefing rooms and barracks, listening to their officers paint terrifying pictures of American brutality. The stories had been told with such detail, such conviction, that doubt had never been an option. The Americans treat their prisoners like animals, Captain Muller had declared, his scarred face twisted with disgust. Their women especially suffer fates I cannot speak aloud. They are a nation of barbarians who know nothing of honor or decency. Greta remembered how her stomach had turned as the captain described supposed atrocities committed in other camps, stories of starvation, of women paraded naked for the amusement of guards, of worse things that he claimed happened under cover of darkness. The other nurses had gasped and wept, but the captain had shown no mercy in his descriptions. "You must understand," he had continued, pacing before them like a caged wolf, "surrender is not an option. Death is preferable to the shame that awaits you in American hands. They will strip away not just your uniforms, but your dignity, your humanity itself." Maria, the young secretary, had raised a trembling hand. "But, sir, surely the Geneva Convention—" "The Americans spit on such conventions," the captain had roared. "They are not civilized like we are. They are descendants of criminals and savages, and they will treat you accordingly." Now, as the truck doors creaked open and American voices barked orders in a language they barely understood, those warnings felt like iron chains around their hearts. Every gesture would be interpreted through the lens of expected cruelty. Every command would sound like a prelude to torment. The propaganda had done its work perfectly. These women were not just prisoners of war. They were prisoners of their own indoctrinated terror, trapped behind walls of fear that had been carefully constructed by their own leaders. The Americans waiting outside didn't just have to overcome their resistance, they had to overcome months of psychological conditioning that had painted them as monsters incarnate. As the first woman was ordered out of the truck, her legs nearly buckled. The fear was so complete, so overwhelming, that it threatened to consume them entirely before their captors had even spoken a word. The sunlight struck them like a physical blow as they emerged from the trucks. Greta squinted against the brightness, her medical training automatically noting the signs of shock in herself and her companions: rapid breathing, pale skin, trembling hands. But medical knowledge couldn't calm the terror that gripped her heart as she faced her first American soldier. He was enormous, at least 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. His uniform was pristine, his rifle held with casual confidence. When he spoke, his voice was deep and commanding, though the words were incomprehensible to most of the women. "Form a line! Single file! Keep your hands visible!" The translator, a German-American sergeant, repeated the orders, but even in their native language, the commands sounded threatening. Every word felt like a precursor to violence. When the massive soldier gestured toward a building, several women flinched, as if he had raised his hand to strike. Maria, the young secretary, found herself directly in front of an American guard during the processing. He held a clipboard and was checking names against a list, his face stern and unreadable. When he looked up at her, she braced for a blow, for harsh words, for the beginning of the humiliation she had been promised. Instead, he simply said, "Name?" She stammered out her response in broken English, certain that her accent would provoke anger. But the guard simply made a mark on his paper and moved to the next woman. No violence, no mockery, just routine military procedure. Inside the processing building, the women were photographed and given identification numbers. The American soldiers went about their duties with an efficiency that was almost boring in its normalcy. They checked belongings, recorded personal information, and assigned barracks numbers with the same mechanical precision their own army had used. But the women's terror remained absolute. When one guard reached into his pocket, 3 women ducked, certain he was drawing a weapon. When another pointed toward the barracks, they interpreted the gesture as a threat. Their indoctrinated fear transformed every neutral action into evidence of impending cruelty. The most unsettling moment came when Greta watched an American soldier help an elderly German woman who had stumbled during the lineup. He steadied her arm and spoke quietly to her, his tone gentle despite the language barrier. The woman looked up at him with such shock that Greta felt her own worldview begin to shift ever so slightly. Could monsters show such casual kindness? The question was dangerous, treasonous even, but it planted itself in her mind like a seed in fertile ground. The dining hall was larger than anything they had expected. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, each set with metal trays, cups, and eating utensils. But it was the smell that stopped them in their tracks, the rich, warm aroma of real food, bread baking, meat cooking, vegetables steaming. For women who had subsisted on meager rations for months, the abundance was overwhelming. Their stomachs clenched with hunger, even as their minds screamed warnings about poison and trickery. "It's a trap," whispered Anna, a radio operator who had barely spoken since their capture. "They want us to eat so they can watch us die." The American guards gestured for them to sit, but most of the women remained standing, staring at the food as if it were a nest of vipers. Bowls of thick stew were placed before them, steam rising into the cool air, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, coffee that actually smelled like coffee, not the bitter substitute they had grown accustomed to. Greta's medical training warred with her indoctrinated fear. The food looked wholesome, nutritious even, but the warnings echoed in her mind. They will poison you slowly, making your death a prolonged agony for their amusement. The turning point came when Sergeant Davis, a tall American guard with kind eyes, sat down at a nearby table. He filled his own bowl with the same stew that had been served to the prisoners, the same bread, the same coffee. Without ceremony, he began to eat, chewing thoughtfully as he reviewed some paperwork. Maria watched him intently. If the food was poisoned, why would he eat it? If this was some elaborate torture, why would he consume the same meal? The logic was inescapable, yet her fear remained. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her spoon and took a small sip of the stew. The flavor exploded across her taste buds, rich, savory, with actual pieces of meat and vegetables. It was better than anything she had eaten in months, perhaps years. One by one, the other women began to follow her example. The hall filled with the quiet sounds of eating, spoons clinking against bowls, the soft tearing of bread, the careful sipping of hot coffee. For many, it was the first real meal they had enjoyed since the war began. As she ate, Greta felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but shifting. The absolute certainty of American brutality wavered for the first time. If they were truly the savages described by her officers, would they feed their prisoners so well? Would they eat the same food themselves? The questions were dangerous, but they were real. And for the first time since her capture, Greta began to wonder if everything she had been told might not be the complete truth. The days that followed brought a series of small revelations that chipped away at the women's carefully constructed fears. It began with incidents so minor they might have been overlooked, but in their heightened state of awareness, every gesture carried enormous weight. Greta was struggling with a heavy bucket of water from the camp well when Corporal Johnson appeared beside her. Without a word, he took the bucket from her hands and carried it to where she needed it, setting it down with a casual nod before walking away. She stood frozen, staring after him, her mind racing to understand what had just happened. According to everything she had been taught, American soldiers would exploit any opportunity to humiliate German women. Yet this man had simply helped her with a task, expecting nothing in return, showing no interest in her beyond basic human courtesy. Maria experienced her own moment of confusion when she dropped her blanket while crossing the compound yard. Before she could retrieve it, an American guard had scooped it up and handed it back to her, even shaking off the dust before returning it to her arms. His smile was brief but genuine, and Maria found herself stammering thanks in broken English. The medical station provided Greta with the most challenging observations. When one of the German women developed a fever, the American medic treated her with the same care he would show to his own soldiers. He checked her temperature, provided aspirin, and even brought her extra blankets. His touch was professional, gentle, completely devoid of the cruelty she had been promised to expect. "Why are they doing this?" Maria whispered to Greta during their evening meal. "The captain said they would torment us, humiliate us, but they're treating us like people." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to face. Around them, other women were having similar conversations in hushed tones. Stories were shared of guards who had offered cigarettes, who had helped with heavy lifting, who had shown basic human decency in a dozen small ways. Not all the women were ready to abandon their fears. Some insisted these kindnesses were part of an elaborate psychological torture designed to lower their defenses before the real cruelty began. But their arguments were growing weaker each day, overwhelmed by the accumulating evidence of simple humanity. One evening, as autumn rain drummed against the barracks windows, they heard something that shook them more than any kindness had. From somewhere in the American section of the camp, the sound of a harmonica drifted through the night air. The melody was slow, almost melancholy, a tune that spoke of homesickness and longing. The music was so human, so vulnerable, that several women found themselves crying. Not from fear, but from the recognition of shared humanity. The men guarding them missed their homes too. They had families, dreams, sorrows just like any other people. It was becoming impossible to see them as monsters. The barracks had become a place of whispered conversations and dangerous thoughts. As the days passed and no cruelty materialized, the women found themselves grappling with questions that threatened the very foundation of everything they had believed. I wrote to my sister before the war, Anna said quietly, her voice barely audible in the darkness. She lived in America for 2 years before coming home to Germany. She never wrote about savages or barbarians. She wrote about neighbors who helped her garden, about shopkeepers who remembered her name. The admission hung in the air like a confession. To speak positively about Americans had been tantamount to treason in the Germany they had known. But here, surrounded by evidence that contradicted their indoctrination, the women found themselves sharing memories they had previously suppressed. Greta told them about her medical textbooks, some of which had been translated from American journals. The techniques, the dedication to saving lives, the oath to first do no harm. These were not the products of a savage culture. They were the works of a people who valued human life. "But we were told," Maria began, then stopped herself. The weight of their situation was becoming clear. They had been told many things, and those things were proving to be lies. The sound of the harmonica drifted through the barracks again, this time playing a melody they recognized, a folk tune that existed in both German and American traditions. The guard playing it probably had no idea that his prisoners knew the song, but they did. Some of them had grown up singing it. "My grandmother used to sing that tune," whispered Elsa, a telephone operator who had rarely spoken since their capture. She learned it from her grandfather, who learned it from immigrants who came to America generations ago. It's the same song. The realization was staggering. These people they had been taught to hate, these enemies who were treating them with unprecedented kindness, shared the same cultural roots. They sang the same songs, told similar stories, valued many of the same things. "What if—" Greta began, then stopped, afraid to voice the thought that had been growing in her mind for days. "What if what?" Maria prompted gently. "What if everything we were told about them was a lie? What if our leaders needed us to hate them so completely that they created stories, invented atrocities, made us believe things that simply weren't true?" The silence that followed was deafening. No one rushed to contradict her, but no one immediately agreed either. The implications were too enormous, too dangerous to accept easily. But seeds of doubt, once planted, are difficult to destroy. And in the darkness of that barracks, surrounded by women who had expected to be tortured and instead found themselves treated with dignity, those seeds were taking root. 3 months later, as autumn gave way to winter, the women gathered their few possessions for release. The war was ending, and they would be repatriated to a Germany that had been forever changed. But they too had been transformed in ways that would echo through the rest of their lives. Greta stood at the camp gates, the same iron barriers that had seemed so ominous upon her arrival. Now they represented not imprisonment, but the boundary between two worlds, the world of indoctrinated hatred she had left behind, and the world of complex human truth she was about to re-enter. Sergeant Davis approached her with a clipboard, processing her release paperwork with the same professional courtesy he had shown throughout her captivity. But today he also handed her something else, a small photograph of his family back home, his wife and 2 young daughters smiling at the camera from their front porch in Ohio. "For remembering," he said in his halting German, "that enemies can become friends." The photograph trembled in Greta's hands. This man, who could have been cruel, who could have used his power to humiliate and degrade, had instead chosen to share his most precious possessions, his humanity and the faces of those he loved. Maria received her own farewell gift, a small book of American poetry, inscribed with words in English she was still learning to read. "May you find truth wherever you go." The guard who gave it to her, Corporal Rodriguez, had spent weeks teaching her English phrases during quiet moments in the camp. As the women walked through the gates toward waiting transport trucks, they carried more than their belongings. They carried questions that would haunt them forever. Questions about truth and propaganda, about the nature of humanity, about the lies that nations tell their people to justify hatred. Some would struggle with these questions for the rest of their lives. Others would find peace in the recognition that humanity transcends national boundaries, that kindness can exist even in the heart of warfare, that the capacity for good exists in all people regardless of the uniform they wear. But all of them would remember the American guards who had treated them not as conquered enemies, but as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. They would remember the meals shared, the small kindnesses offered, the music played in the darkness of foreign nights. Years later, when their children asked about the war, these women would tell complicated stories. Stories about fear and propaganda, about the terrible power of indoctrination, about the even greater power of human kindness to overcome hatred. They had entered that camp as prisoners, terrified of their captors, and certain of their fate. They left as witnesses to a truth their own leaders had tried to hide from them, that their enemies were capable of mercy, of dignity, of treating even their prisoners as fellow human beings. The iron gates closed behind them, but the gates in their minds had been opened forever. Fear had been their prison, but truth had set them free. In a world torn apart by hatred and propaganda, they had discovered something precious and rare, the recognition that beneath the uniforms and flags and rhetoric of war, people are simply people, capable of both cruelty and kindness, but always ultimately human.